4 of this series. Um, very glad to see that so many of you have stayed with us for the last many days. Today's session is a very important session. It's on end-of-life care and bereavement, which for some of us is a familiar topic, but for many, I'm sure it's not a topic that you come across quite often. And I'm very pleased to introduce you to our two facilitators today. You know both of them by now. Dr. Rajshri will be leading us through the session, and Dr. Rajni will be co-facilitating. And I really hope that you've had a chance to go through the ebook and the webinar, and I trust that this will be an interactive and enriching experience for everybody. So without any delay, Dr. Rajni, I'm going to hand over to you for the recap and take us through the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Smriti, and thank you to all the participants. As Smriti said, it's really been a wonderful experience for all of us as facilitators and co-facilitators to walk along with you on this journey. And you know, in the last few days, we've been walking alongside Ramesh and his family and trying our best to support them through a very difficult time. And through Ramesh and his family's eyes, we have got a window into the experience and the challenges that are faced by the patients and the caregivers, as well as the doctors and nurses who are taking care of Ramesh and his family's concerns. And we went through a process of getting an introduction into what the ethics and the difference in triage in the setting of COVID is, and we also looked at what his symptoms are. We addressed the complexity of all the problems that Ramesh was facing, given his age and his comorbidities. We went through all the ways in which we can support him, considering the fact that aggressive interventions may not be the most beneficial response or treatment modality for him. And with all of these challenges of ethics and intense discussions with family, yesterday we had a really fruitful session of communication as well. And we went through the ways and means, and I really enjoyed the kind of interaction that we had yesterday with so many wonderful ideas coming from this group, which seems to be so interested and engaged in every possible new innovative idea that we can possibly access to overcome the challenges of communication in the times of COVID. So I really want to thank all of you for the ideas that you have given us. We got a lot from you, and we continue to get a lot from you while we are on this journey of sharing. And I'm really looking forward to today's session. I know that for a lot of us, talking about the end of life is something that fills us with some apprehension, some discomfort, because we have to face up to our own mortality at times and our own fallibility and our own vulnerability as doctors, as nurses, as people in healthcare. Dr. Param yesterday brought up the issue of why do we look at death as our failure? And today we are going to look at that a little closer, and I'm really glad that the person who will be shepherding us and guiding us through this conversation is someone who is extremely experienced in this, and that's Dr. Rajshri. So with that recap of where we are in this journey with Ramesh and his family, I hand it over to Dr. Rajshri.
Thank you, Rajni, and thank you, Smriti, and welcome all dear friends for the fourth session of our webinars, Pali-COVID Echo Series. I dedicate this session to my dear team members of Pali-COVID Kerala and the extended faculty pool, and to you as well, the participants and the learners who had made us, learn further and further in this respect. With, the kind, sort of, kind and very, very glad comment which Rajni had given me like very experienced faculty, I am bit, bit overwhelmed, bit confused. I am just struggling to I'm struggling to speak on end of life care because that is a very shady area. As professionals, we tend to, provide end of life care, but none of us have experienced how end of life will be. So it's a very, very difficult, distressing area, as Rajni had rightly pointed out. So let us hope that this is going to be an interactive session. And I would like to comment that this is an appendix of the sessions which we had done so far, like triage, symptom control, and communication. And this is just a preface for tomorrow's session, making sense of distress. So end of life care exactly straddles midway between. So with that introduction, I am just moving on to my slides. Hope you can see my screen. Is it all right?
Absolutely clear, Raji. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, as such, understanding death as a natural event, Rajni has rightly mentioned that in yesterday's session. Why do we professionals look at end of life care or death as a professional failure? No. It's not like that. It is a natural event. It is just taking the other side or the end or other spectrum of our life trajectory. One in its birth and the other in its death. And with that knowledge, we have to learn how important it is to learn and give proper end of life care. Having said that, it is very essential for us to emphasize the relevance and challenges of end of life care with respect to COVID-19 and what are the principles and strategies for providing good end of life care. Hope all of you might have gone through the algorithms and the e-toolkit, and you might have downloaded the PaliCare app, which is a very helpful learning tool in learning the basic principles of palliative care and symptom control, and as well as end of life care. So let us be a bit philosophical. Our great philosophers and writers, they have understood and clearly depicted it very early that death is just part of life, and any civilization that denies death, that ends by denying life as well. And Khalil Gibran, the famous Lebanese poet, he has clearly mentioned that you cannot separate death from life, and because they flow together. So with that, introduction, I am going to bit more challenging or overwhelming question. So this is a break for us to think. Have you ever thought of our own death? As Rajani has pointed out, it is a very disturbing, uncomfortable thought for all of us. Though all of us know that all of us will die on one day. It is inevitable and universally applicable to all of us. But still, we are uncomfortable to talk about death, and we turn our faces away from the fact of death. And what is that stirs your mind when you do so? What is that kind of, that kind of disturbance or, like stirring that, splashes in your mind when we think of our own death? So wait there, what sort of death most of us prefer? Sudden, instantaneous, while we are in deep sleep, while we are in action, as it had happened to our former president, His Excellency, Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam. He just collapsed and passed away while he was delivering a lecture on a scientific session. What kind of a death? Oh, as a palliative care professional, do we prefer a bit more lingering death, like to be on bed for a few days or few weeks and to say goodbye to all dear and loved ones and then simply pass away? Or where do you like to have it? In the hospital or some spiritual places or at home itself? And who do you want to be with you? Our own family members, loved ones, friends, or some spiritual leaders? Have we ever thought about all those things? And the most important thing, are we really bothered about how others die? And death is a point very subtle or sensitive or strange or complex point where the ethical principles, they may seem to lose balance. We may lose our autonomy. Uh, we may lose control on many things. So, having said that, how much are we bothered about how others die? You can take a break and think. So, why end of life care is important? So, if our own death is so important for us, end of life care for other person is also equally important. So, why is it important? In 2015, Lean Foundation has done a global survey to see how good end of life care is. It is so sad to see that our country ranks 67 out of 80. Again, I have to emphasize, we have improved our position from 40, that means the last of all 40 countries in 2010 to 67 out of 80 countries in 2015. But that is not a glorious position at all. We are still far behind many countries in providing good end-of-life care. So what are the factors this Lean Foundation has considered to say that good end-of-life care or end-of-life care is provided in a very good manner before publishing it in Economics Intelligence Unit? The most important was palliative and healthcare involvement. So it accounts for almost 20% of the weightage. It encompasses the availability of general healthcare setting and availability of palliative care delivery. So see how it is important and how palliative care is closely associated with providing good quality of end-of-life care. So the next indicators were human resources, which accounts for availability of trained professionals for providing end-of-life care, and the training made available for them again accounts for another 20%, and affordability of care, the cost of care and availability in the public health setting and the insurance schemes and other support service offered from the administrative setup, these account for another 20%. And the quality of care, which is based on guiding tools, the scales, quality indicators, opioid availability, and partnership in care. That accounts for the major chunk of 30%. And the community engagement with trained volunteer network and creating public awareness about palliative care and particularly end-of-life care accounts for another 10%. Probably with the last component, community engagement, Kerala has specially mentioned that it has got a place in providing good quality of end-of-life care. That is the reason why Kerala's palliative care has gained, national importance. So in the next slide, we come to a very important statement by Jan Stensvard, a Swedish oncologist and a palliative care physician, and he was the pioneer in developing WHO 3-step analgesic ladder. See, the statement is, we want to give those who are to live the life the same care and attention that we give to those who enter the life, the newborns. So that clearly, it makes the things very clear. Each one of you very well know that the kind of compassionate care we give to the newborn babies. So affectionately we care for them. So when it comes to end-of-life care, as a medical student, I have seen years ago that patients who are actively dying, they will be pushed away to the corner of the ward without giving much attention. One intravenous fluid will be on flow, and one half empty or near empty oxygen cylinder also will be kept beside the cot. Apart from that, no professional used to give proper attention to the patient as well as the so-called family member who are often designated as the bystander, which is a very, very unhealthy and unfriendly term. Okay. So let us see what are the relevance and the challenges of end-of-life care in the context of COVID-19. I will take a break here and invite all of you to put your suggestions in the chat box. I invite Dr. Rajni to see the chat box and be with me uh, in the discussion further.
So, Dr. Raji, while they are putting in their thoughts about the special challenges in the context of COVID, I thought I'll just share quickly what has come up so far with the thoughts about death and the personal reflections. So, for most of our participants, what is important, what they wish for is either a sudden death or a death in a peaceful, natural surrounding, or in their own homes in the company of loved ones. What people fear is a long drawn out, dragged out process of suffering. Smriti brought up a very important point of loss of dignity. Will somebody have to clean me up? I may not be independent at that time. And a really, lots of very philosophical thoughts came up about what, as if death could be like waking up from a dream. What happens after death? What happens to the thoughts and memories of a person once they are gone? It's hard to answer the philosophical side of things about what happens to the thoughts and memories of a person when they're gone. But we do know that the thoughts and memories of that last moment does stay on in the minds and hearts of the caregivers and the people who are witness to that. So with palliative care, we can at least try to alleviate the suffering of those who stay on. Our attention is to the patient and the family and even the healthcare providers around at this time.
Rajni, that is wonderful, and I am overwhelmed. I think you people made my day today. So it is so philosophical that, I am speechless now. All of us prefer to have, a very comfortable, death. And most of us, I believe, we prefer to die at home amidst our dear and loved ones. But that is not something which happens quite frequently. And, we will be taken to hospital. And as we have said earlier, we lose our autonomy, and, probably our family caregivers also will be in a state of panic. So we will be under a lot of pressure, and the professionals try on many interventions. Many times it could be futile, but it is very good that you came up with a good suggestion, and the point which Smriti had brought to dying with dignity, that is most important. Dying with dignity is most important. And just like how do we feel, the last the last hours, that memory that will definitely stay in the minds of the family caregivers forever. That is very true. And I think you people, you have walked ahead of my presentation, I should say. So Rajni, come on again.
So many interesting concepts and challenges coming up, Dr. Rajshri. At present, the challenges of end-of-life care in the context of COVID, our participants are sharing with us are that there is no family around to bid goodbye. In some places, and these are the better places, the family members may be allowed to attend at the bedside with PPE on, but these are the better places where they have the facility for a family member to be there at the end of life, and that is very few and far between across the world. The thought of leaving without saying goodbye, the thought of no proper burial ceremony or last rites not being performed, there's a spiritual angst over here, and isolation and loneliness.
Yes.
So great frustration for everyone all around.
Okay. Very good, brilliant suggestions. Okay, so shall I move ahead?
Yes, please. Yes, let's do it.
So, as we have discussed in the previous sessions, it is a very acute illness with fast progression. So, less time for preparedness for the family members. So, today you are diagnosed with COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 infection. Tomorrow you will be taken to the hospital, first line treatment center or COVID treatment center. So, a couple of days later, you are just, you will be shifted to the ICU. And and the next day you are informed that your loved one is just declining very rapidly. So nobody knows what has been happening. It happened to quite, I mean, a couple of my friends. So they were finding it very difficult to digest the fact that everything happened within a span of 4 or 5 days. So there is less time for preparedness for even the professionals also. So we have only limited information. Even now we are just swimming in an ocean. So where this the virus is leading us. So dilemma in decision making is very profound, whether to or whether not to do. And information overload, high level of anxiety created by the media and the press. It is just like they are making the news or the information highly sensational. So the public get captured by the flash news and the breaking news. So everybody is utterly confused. Even Kerala, the state of Kerala is also under the thought of going on to lockdown again because of the hike in the positive cases. So isolation from family members, it is profound. As you have mentioned, in some centers, family members with professional personal protection equipment will be allowed to enter, but it is not very common. It is not a bliss which is accessible for many people. So it makes grieving process highly complicated. And personal protection equipment hinders effective communication, though Param had mentioned strategies to overcome that barrier. And inappropriate artificial life support measures adds to suffering to the professional, to the patient definitely, and to the family caregivers, and to the resources as well. It's a waste many times. And as one of the participants or many of you have pointed out, there is like a spiritual conflict also. I mean, why me? And so everything put together, end of life care is even more complex than existing. So what is appropriate treatment? So what is appropriate treatment with respect to end of life care? So key points which we need to consider are patient's biological prospects. Bring Ramesh with us. So what was Ramesh having? He was a 70+ year old gentleman with lots of comorbidities. So with SARS-CoV-2 infection, how his biological prospects going to be? He's a candidate or is a patient with very low or poor outcome that we have seen. And therapeutic aim and benefits of each treatment. That's important. Why are we giving treatment? In order to give some kind of benefit. If not possible, if cure is not possible, at least some kind of relief we should be able to provide. So are we able to achieve that? And adverse effect of each treatment, any treatment, even the simple paracetamol also can have some kind of adverse or side effect. So think of the adverse effect of each treatment before starting it. And the need is not to prescribe a lingering death. Our aim is to give good quality of end of life care, to make the last hours as comfortable as possible. Our aim is not to prescribe a lingering death. That is very important. So regarding inappropriate or futile management, ICMR on 12th March 2018 came with a definite clarity on terms and explanation. Sometimes we professionals, as we live in a death-denying culture, we will be in a state of dilemma to withhold or withdraw a potentially inappropriate treatment for fear that we are causing a death of the patient. So that is not correct. Withholding or withdrawing a potentially inappropriate treatment in a patient dying with a terminal or advanced illness cannot be construed as an intention to kill. Patient may die. That is not because we professionals withhold or withdraw an inappropriate treatment, but the patient is slowly declining on the disease trajectory and he comes to or he faces with a natural death. It is not because of our intervention, and it cannot be construed as an intention to kill. And it cannot be termed as euthanasia, as passive euthanasia as well. Euthanasia is cannot be passive. It is an active procedure where the intention is to kill. But on the other hand, withholding or withdrawing a potentially inappropriate treatment is focused on comfort measures, providing comfort during the last hours of life, and thereby improving the dignity of life and end of life care. So we should not forget Ramesh. He is here with us. His condition has deteriorated further, and now the clear aim is good end of life care. The medical team has decided to call a video conference, including the whole family, regarding discussion of goals of care. We have gone through the details of goals of care, which was vividly explained by Moira. You might be thorough with that. Now, based on the goals of care, how do we ensure good quality end of life care to Ramesh? Let us see the chat box.
Dr. Rajiv, while we're waiting for some more inputs on how people would define good quality end of life care, some points that came up were about advanced care planning with living wills, the legality of certain things. You raised the point of withdrawing and withholding and the intention behind withdrawing and withholding versus euthanasia, which was really beautifully explained. And Dr. Sheetal brought up that, sometimes in the absence of like-minded clinical teams and good hospital protocols, sometimes it's an uphill battle for some physicians who might be attuned to palliative care principles, but if the entire institutional support isn't there, it isn't always easy to carry it out in practice.
Okay, Rajni. I mean, advanced care planning and living will, it's a very, very detailed topic which cannot be comprised in a very short session like this. Advanced care planning, it comes very well in the goals of care discussion as well, because that is the reason why we do triage and goals of care discussion, as Moira had explained it on the very first session. So as soon as the patient is diagnosed with SARS-CoV-2, and when he was taken to the COVID hospital itself, with his age and the comorbidities, we should have a plan, and we should start communicating with the patient if possible, otherwise the family members well in advance. This is the status, and this is the point from where we are starting, but we hope that something positive can be brought out. But definitely we have certain challenges, and let us see how the treatment or the interventions are going to come out. And as the days moved on, so now we have come to a state that Ramesh's condition has deteriorated, and finally there is no point in ventilating him further, or no point in doing any aggressive measures. So now the professionals, they have decided to call the family members to explain further that okay, there is now he is just drifting away. So now we have to focus on to make the remaining life as comfortable as possible. At this point, I would say that good quality end of life care is to make the remaining part of the life to its fullest, the best out possible.
So some suggestions have come in.
Yeah,
and some of the suggestions about what is good quality end of life care is trying to make sure that the family's presence is there at the end of life, making sure that symptom management is optimal, making sure that the little details, secondary infection, catheter, NG tubing, oral care, bed sores, tube care, this is important. So minimizing the tiny little things which will all add to the suffering of the patient. Very important issue. Cultural awareness is important to render good quality end of life care. So in addition to the physical, the psychosocial, the family and the cultural setup, all of these will come into good quality end of life care.
Exactly. This is what I am about to focus on. So this is the end of life care in the algorithm, which is detailed detailed in the toolkit. So there it is. I mean, I will just quickly go through the algorithm. It is detailed in the toolkit. Patients not getting active medical treatment for COVID-19, aim of end of life care is to reduce suffering by managing distressing symptom and support of patients, support of caregivers, empower caregivers in appropriate interventions in home care setting. If patient has to be taken home, that is a remote possibility in the country, but there are countries where end of life care is being provided at home as well. And we have to focus on non-pharmacological interventions as well, using standard precautions like PPE, hand hygiene, oral care, nasogastric tube care, catheter care, and all those positioning and skin care, eye care, etc. And pharmacological care as well, like using algorithms for breathlessness, agitation, secretions, fever, pain, etc. And review route of administration of drugs and consider subcutaneous administration wherever possible. And psychosocial and spiritual support for the patient and the family are quite important. Many of you have mentioned that, and we are so glad to see that the holistic approach is coming in very frequently. And goals of care discussion and facilitate farewell conversation and rethinking rituals. I mean, how it has to be contained within the limits of COVID-19 protocols, and ensure that the patient is not alone, and it follows through grief and bereavement. So here we have the end of life care plan in something like a flow chart, goals of care discussion, and moving from there. And goals of care discussion, it is there at each phase. I mean, that's a point where we make advanced care planning. So according to that, we make a shift from or transition from intensive to palliative care approach. And there is a consistent involvement of the palliative care team, because the symptom profile tend to change quite rapidly during the end of life care hours. So the palliative involvement has to be consistent throughout. And psychosocial and spiritual support to the family is profound. And it is continues as the bereavement support, as Moira has pointed out, clearly pointed in her picture. So what are the principles of end of life care? There should be some guiding principles. I think you have mentioned it earlier, like good symptom control. Rajni, am I right?
Yeah. So a lot of these principles of what is good quality end of life care have been mentioned in the chat box when we asked the question pertinent to Ram.
Okay. So shall I move on to
I think we can proceed.
So yes. Ensure patient comfort through appropriate symptom control. And I have heard Rajni echoing your thoughts, like refocusing medical and nursing care. I mean, instead of going on to or focusing on to the tiny aspects like checking vitals, like pulse rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, urine output, and all those parameters, we have to come to we have to focus more on the symptoms and holistic approach. And all those tiny or rather silly here matters should be left out. Avoiding unnecessary interventions. That means like reciting the cannula, putting an indwelling catheter, or if it is inappropriate, or replacing the central venous catheter, placing an nasogastric tube. If those things can be avoided, it should be avoided altogether. All these may be unnecessary. And reviewing all medicines and symptoms regularly. That is what we have seen in the previous slide. And the symptoms, they fluctuate quite frequently. And it's very true with symptoms like agitation. You know, the waxing and waning pattern may be quite significant. So as Institute of Palliative Medicine, Calicut, where I learned principles of palliative care, they used to keep something like an end of life care chart, you know, or like 4-hourly or 12-hourly assessment, which is routinely given for patients who are put in under the category of end of life care. So there, the nursing staff they go and visit the patients quite frequently, like 4-hourly, or there are separate schedules for that. There, the symptoms are quite frequently reviewed, and the medicines are changed, and even the routes are changed according to the symptom symptom presentation. So maintain effective communication, even when the patient is not able to communicate. Before doing any intervention or procedure or any drug administration, we have to talk to the patient, assuming is not right always, but here assuming in a positive way, assuming that he is listening to us, we should communicate to him. And effective communication should be the mainstay when we talk to the family members as well. And I don't have to highlight, yesterday you had attended a very wonderful session from Param, how effective communication has to be carried out, and provide psychosocial support to the family members. And strategies of effective end-of-life care with respect to symptom management. These are the common symptoms like breathlessness, agitation, pain, fever, secretions, pressure injury or pressure ulcer. Why I have said pressure injury is stage 1 pressure ulcer doesn't have an ulcer. It is only skin change. And many professionals overlook that. There is only skin change. There is no development of an ulcer. So that's a reason why I termed it as pressure injury. That is a new recommendation. Appropriate personal protection equipment should be used while managing all the symptoms. All professional caregivers have to take adequate precautions. So breathlessness, you have seen that injection morphine 5 milligram subcutaneously, 2.5 milligram intravenously, or in institutions where fentanyl is more frequently used, you can give injection fentanyl 50 microgram as well instead of morphine, though it is an expensive option. And injection midazolam 5 milligram subcutaneously or 2.5 milligram intravenously. Why we are combining midazolam with morphine, you may be knowing well, because breathlessness, when it is severe, it is always associated with anxiety as well, because severe breathlessness will give you a feeling that you are going to die imminent. So it's always better to combine a benzodiazepine with an opioid to effect in a better symptom control. It is if you are giving a bolus, like you can try giving bolus every 15 to 30 minutes until the symptoms improve. But once the symptoms improve, it's always better to start a continuous infusion, preferably subcutaneously, with injection morphine or fentanyl doses as indicated, and injection midazolam 50 milligram to 60 milligram subcutaneously or intravenously over 24 hours. Subcutaneous route of administration is always preferable because it poses less chance of infection. We will come to that later in next few slides. Coming to agitation, injection haloperidol 20 milligram and injection midazolam 30 milligram, again as a continuous infusion, either intravenous or subcutaneous over 24 hours. Agitation, again, Sunita had mentioned, the patient will be experiencing horrendous agitation, so it is always better to combine an antipsychotic with a benzodiazepine to have better symptom control. And delirium in COVID-19 is reported to be very troublesome and challenging for the professionals. And we have pain and fever. We can use paracetamol 500 milligram to 1 gram 6th hourly to a maximum of 4 gram over 24 hours, either as intravenous infusion or suppository. And during end-of-life phase, though we can give NSAIDs, it is always, I prefer to withdraw or withhold it because of the altered renal function. And another factor is that paracetamol is one of the analgesics which I trust most, because it is very safe in the pediatric as well as in the geriatric population. It may be given as an intravenous infusion as well. If the patient is not in a position to swallow, you can give it as intravenous infusion. And if you're not comfortable to give intravenous infusion, with adequate precaution, personal protection, you can give it as rectal route as well as suppository. This also works pretty well. And if the patient is already on opioids, continue according to the response. Having said that, I have to reiterate the fact that the pain assessment would be difficult, as responses will be either sluggish or even absent. We may not be used the typical pain scales or tool we commonly use for assessing the pain and its response, because the patient may not be in a position to respond. So we have to go according to certain cues given by the patient, like, when you turn the patient or lift the patient, you have to observe how the the face changes, whether they frown or whether they show some facial expressions of some discomfort or distress. So we have to go according to that. So that is the reason why I have mentioned we may have to review the patient and modify the drugs and the routes of administration quite regularly and frequently. And secretions. Suction is best avoided because of for fear of droplet or aerosol generation, which could be which could lead to disease transmission. So simple position change to facilitate the drainage would be sufficient to control secretion. But if the secretions are troublesome, you may use anti-silagogues, glycopyrrolate, 200 to 400 microgram, I mean 0.2 milligram to 0.4 milligram 4 hourly, either intravenously or subcutaneously, or hyoscine butyl bromide, that is Buscopan, 20 to 40 milligram 4 hourly, again intravenously or subcutaneously, are good anti-silagogues. And if you don't have an access to these anti-silagogues, you may use 1% atropine, which is available as an ophthalmic solution, 1 to 2 drops 4 hourly. And this may be given sublingually as well. And having said that, like glycopyrrolate, which is a very powerful anti-silagogue, and if you give it, like as mentioned, 4 hourly and all, it may lead to profound drying of secretion. So I would like to I would invite my nursing colleagues to come with suggestions. What happens if the oral cavity of the patient or person gets unduly dried? What is the problem?
While we are waiting for responses from our nursing colleagues to educate us about the challenges we face with dry mouth and suctioning, there is one question that has come up, which is about how can we avoid respiratory depression when we use morphine and midazolam for relief of breathlessness. And there are responses coming saying that it's a very low dose, we won't cause much respiratory depression. But I think it would be important to address the primary intention and the secondary effect which may happen, and here what our intention is, that we are looking for relief of the breathlessness and suffering, and we accept at sometimes that there may be some depression when we are in active dying, absolutely at the end of life.
Absolutely correct, Rajni. You have brought it very nicely. And, like opioids, because of their action on the respiratory control system in the brain, they have a direct depressant action on the respiratory center. It's a fact. But I will move to that slide again. See, morphine injection, I am just showing the slide on breathlessness. Injection morphine, 2.5 milligram intravenously. With injection midazolam, 2.5 milligram intravenously. When you are giving it, it's a slow intravenous bolus dose. Checking for the pulse and respiratory rate. It is unlikely that the patient will go into sudden respiratory depression. I am speaking from my own personal experience. We have tried it with, patients who are coming to us for symptom control, and also patients in end of life phase. In end of life phase, the gravity or the severity of breathlessness is so, it is so thick that 2.5 milligram intravenous morphine, they will take it as a bliss so that they can breathe easily. One thing is that Sunita had highlighted it in her presentation. It just slows down the response to hypercarbia. That is one action that, how morphine acts. It reduces respiratory rate, but it does not bring respiratory rate to that low level to cause a respiratory depression unless we give it judiciously. That clause is very important. We keep a definite track or definite, clear follow-up when we administer morphine. We cannot give a bolus and say, look at the rate and then proceed further. That is how we give. And once you stabilize, this continuous infusion, with 30 milligram morphine and midazolam 15 milligram over 24 hours, it is going to produce symptom control rather than respiratory depression. I am sure. And this dose, it is unlikely to cause. But even then, as Rajini had pointed out, we have to be ready for facing a respiratory depression, which may ensue, that may not be due to morphine alone. It could be as part of the declining status of the patient. Have I explained it appropriately?
I think that was wonderful. The clarification that the patient's worsening clinical condition is responsible for the overall depression and not the 2.5 milligrams of morphine. So when we put in these orders, we can also clarify that if the patient is appearing comfortable, resting comfortably, you don't need to give the dose at that time. We titrate it to the desired effect of relief of breathlessness. But your point was fabulous, ma'am, about understanding that it's the overall clinical deterioration of the patient which is causing this depression and not just that small dose of morphine.
Again, I would reiterate, like Rajini, you may be knowing that because morphine produces pulmonary vasodilatation, thereby it affects in better ventilation perfusion match, and also it reduces the work of breathing. So definitely it produces comfort for breathlessness. So that's the reason why pulmonologists have come forward for giving morphine in chronic breathlessness as well. Am I right?
Absolutely. We use it in the outpatient setting as well for chronic breathlessness. So it's used in the acute setting as well as chronic setting. And we see a great relief for patients and a much better quality of life in those who are ambulatory and outside with advanced or progressive lung diseases. And in the acute setting, like for Mr. Ramesh, we definitely see it's remarkable, the relief and suffering that you get with these small doses.
Okay. So what do our nurses say about dryness, dry mouth?
So I haven't, so one of the things that come up is that patients can develop oral thrush and very foul smelling breath. The use of glycopyrrolate can cause thick secretions in tubes which can get blocked and suctioning. So if you have a patient who's already on an ET tube or a tracheostomy, we need to titrate, we need to think of what we are giving the dose for. If we are using the glycopyrrolate for our relief or for the patient's relief, really is what one needs to think of.
Very good, very good, very good suggestion. So too thick secretions will add to symptom burden. Not only for the patient, for the professional also. You may find it very difficult to take it out. And xerostomia is uncomfortable for the patient and facilitate fungal colonization. Our normal, that moisture in the mouth is essential for, for avoiding fungal colonization. So if the mouth becomes dry, that is one of the leading cause for oral thrush or oral candidiasis. So this should be thought in mind. So regarding pressure injury, again, I invite my nursing colleagues, what are their experiences? I specifically look upon the comments from the nursing participants. So where do you look for pressure ulcer? It's detailed on your toolkit on pages 33 to 36. Rajini, is there any chance?
I would. I'm awaiting that. I would invite more responses regarding pressure injury, and also keep in mind in the setting of COVID. So whether we might have used certain devices on these patients or any new locations where we should be looking out for pressure injuries on these patients as well.
Yeah, that's a very important clue.
So the back, the gluteal region is what people are saying that we need to check on frequently to see is there any pressure injury. NIV can cause nose lesions on the bridge. To be very careful if patients have been advised awake proning as well to see if there are pressure points, because in COVID we know that we do awake proning for patients initially as well, not just prone ventilation, but we do awake proning as well. So to take care at that time for any other pressure points that may come up.
I think Stella, is she there in this group?
Yes, yes, Sister Stella is there. Stella ma'am is there.
Stella, would you like to add some comments on that?
People have suggested air beds, water beds to be used in patients who might be more prone to pressure injury and position changes.
Yeah, particularly they might be useful in the end of life care. Though we do not recommend pressure reducing mattress in otherwise, in non-COVID palliative care patients, because once pressure reducing mattresses are spread, caregivers and the patient himself or herself will think that the mattress will take care of everything and they will just forget about the turning regimes. But in end of life care, too rigid turning regimes could be quite cumbersome for the patients. So I'm glad that participants have come forward with suggestions when patient is given a prone position for awake proning and endotracheal tubes, nasogastric tubes and the mask. And all these gadgets can produce, these are quite often, overlooked.
One more thing that came up is diabetics and old people, the skin being more fragile and vulnerable to breakdown.
Yeah, it's particularly true with elderly people and diabetes. In patients having diabetes, the skin health altogether will be quite, poor. So fragility will be more. So for them, it is very easy to have pressure points. And many people may wonder, do they get pressure injury because worsening and death happens within no time? So do they get? No, it's possible. Even less than 30 minutes of constant application of pressure is sufficient to produce a pressure injury on a vulnerable point. Am I right, Stella? Is she there?
Not sure. Dr. Sheetal brought up a very important point that nowadays we are having a problem with staffing ratios, that there are a lot more patients and these patients, because they are breathless, and they will be not moving around as much. There are more elderly patients in the hospitals with COVID, decreased ADLs. So the risk of pressure sores with overload, understaffing and the comorbidities is going to be much higher.
Yes, that is a very brilliant point, Sheetal. Thank you for that, because these are the areas where we have to focus, like if you're, looking at dyspnea, delirium, the 4Ds.
Yes, Ranjitji, I agree with you. Most of the gadgets what we use will cause pressure ulcers. And it is not that only at the back or the pressure points, which usually we see. But most of the time, the patients who, especially in this COVID time, the patients who are in the ventilators, and suppose there are hundreds of patients that someone has said, we won't be able to look after only one patient. And nurses are also very less. So it happens that ulcers can develop anywhere, even on the hands also, because if they are lying down on a supine position for quite some time itself, they will have ulcers. So the best thing is whatever we are able to do it, we can do it. But another way, hundreds of patients and the nurses has to look after, it's very difficult. But like how they have said, ET tubes, NG tubes, even mask can cause ulcers. It's very difficult.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Stella.
One more really important point Dr. Kamna raised, Dr. Rajshri, I'll quickly raise it as a personal experience she wanted to share, which is that sometimes patients are so uncomfortable in being prone for a long time that they are more comfortable in the lateral position. If they are more comfortable and less in distress, their saturation actually is better on the lateral than on the prone. So we have to spend the time at the bedside and let the patient, that conversation and observation by the patient's bedside, is prone better, lateral better, what can they sustain for a longer period of time?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. It's finally what brings improvement to patients.
It's very correct also. Patients usually lying down on a lateral position is better, even if they have the ET tubes also. That can be adjusted and put.
Okay. So with respect to skincare, the basics: avoiding soiling with fecal matter and urine, and using talcum powders will be most important, and gentle massaging of pressure points and using moisturizers. And here, too rigid turning regimes may be avoided with the use of pressure reducing mattress. So now we have a very, very important and challenging question. After discussion with the treating team regarding goals of care, the family expressed the wish to take Ramesh, home for end of life care, because Ramesh had expressed a wish. I would like to spend my last hours at home, not in hospital. So if it is going to be end of life care, family told the professional that, okay, we would like to take him home. So can he be taken home? What is a government directive about care of COVID-19 positive patients at home? Even if allowed, how can care be given at home? How will their neighbors react? So let us look at the chat box. Can he be taken home?
We'll give a minute or two for people to respond to that, Dr. Raji.
Oh, fine, no problem.
Maybe about a minute, I think, considering our time right
Because
now.
it is quite confusing, I know.
If I can get one or two responses, do you think it is allowed for us to send him home?
To me?
I'm asking the participants.
Okay.
In most state government, we are not allowed to take the patient home if they have severe COVID infection.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
It's true. It's not.
And Priyanka Sethi says it's highly infectious. So the concern is about contagion and spreading to others in the home setting. Yes, so for most states and in most places, it is allowed only for mild cases to be at home, but not for a patient with moderate or severe COVID.
So I will ask a very tricky question here. So we have learned that we have to respect patient autonomy. So Ramesh had expressed his wish to spend his last hours at home. So here we are taking a decision against his wish. So where does the autonomy go?
We have to keep in mind that there are certain laws in place while a pandemic is going on, and the ethics of personal individual care of patient versus ethics of public health sometimes will clash with each other. So that's one point that I would leave there for you to reflect on when you address this issue.
Yeah, exactly. You have said it right. You know, like when it that's what ethical issues have to be finely tuned or balanced with respect to the person and the context. So individual needs have to be balanced with society's interest. So Ramesh had expressed his wish, but it's true that if he has to be taken home, what his family members and the neighbors, what they are going to face. So what is a wider or broader implications? So what should be done to save the best interest of the society? That is a concern here. That's the reason why end of life care is not allowed in states of India so far. But Moira had suggested that in she had like I don't know whether she's there in the group. She had reported that there are places where patients are taken care at home during the end of life hours. I mean, I think there are participants from other countries as well. If they can contribute further, it will be good for us to discuss. So shall I move on?
Yes, I think this is going to be according to local rules and things. So each of us will have to check with the state norms and follow that.
Yes.
This is a conflict in our minds. This will be an ethical dilemma, and this is going to be a source of distress for us, and we must acknowledge it within us.
Yes, exactly. This is a moral distress. It's a moral distress. Okay. So what are the challenges at home or community setting? Suppose if we are living in a state where permission is granted. So what are the challenges? Can we have it?
Can we have inputs even for challenges at home setting in a non-COVID situation as well? Especially from our nursing friends also, maybe if we could get inputs about how they address issues for patients who have to go home, who have significant respiratory distress. How do we inform family how to take care? So a lot of people are saying stigma will be a challenge, larger good justice, educating the caretakers in skills to take care of them. Neighbors may react negatively. So lots of issues coming up.
Lots of issues are coming up. Okay, we will move on. So lack of knowledge and expertise in managing a highly infectious disease. So, okay, I have discharged Ramesh. So how much knowledge and expertise I have imparted to the family members in handling him, caring the patient, disinfection, disposal of waste, following protocols. So one person or one family member will listen to all the instructions given. So he may not be the principal person who is giving care for Ramesh at home. So there will be some loss of message while he convey the message to other person. So the loss of message and the lack of knowledge and expertise is a significant issue, and a lack of professional support in the hospital. We always, the Ramesh is under supervision, so professionals are at arm's length. So that kind of professional support is no more. It is not there, non-existing in a community or rural setting. And it's true that I have instructed to give Ramesh's family caregiver to use paracetamol suppository. I and my nurse colleagues are quite adept in doing that. But how comfortable the family caregiver to do that, to place something in the rectum? And it is very true with other medical gadgets as well. I told them to give injection midazolam or injection haloperidol or this thing, that thing, subcutaneous. So have they been trained adequately? So even if they are trained, the kind of inexperience and the fear of using all those injection and the medications will make them little, bit hesitant and quite inhibited. And in the hospital setting as well, we know that the supply of medicines and personal protection equipment are at scarce. So how do the community people or the family caregivers get an access to that? And the emotional distress, guilt that I have brought him, but if he were in the hospital, we would have been able to give him better care. And I have brought him home. So now there is fear of contagion, not only to me, other family members, neighbors. So what is going to happen in the next moment? If his symptoms get worse, what will I do? That kind of anxiety. And the whole family is going to be isolated for quarantine, and they are cut off from the rest of the civil society, and they have to face stigma from the society. And I think most of these points have been brought in by the candidates, participants, I believe. So what are the strategies? Let us have a look. Appropriate training of the family member for using medicines and gadgets. So, it is not only on verbal mode, also they have to be literally trained how this has to be given, and there should be a written instruction how and when it is to be given, how frequently, that is, like the medicine, the name of the medicine, for what purpose it is given, and what is the route of administration, and why it is for giving, and when it should be given, and all those things should be clearly documented and given. Written, neatly written, not verbally, it's not told. And gadgets as well, like catheter, how to take care of the catheter or nasogastric tube, and how to drain the tube, how to drain the urine, how frequently he has to be fed. If Ramesh is on all these assistive devices, I will. And then routes of administration, subcutaneous, buccal, sublingual, rectal, topical. Having said that, I would like you to comment how comfortable you are, or how frequently you have given this subcutaneous injection. We are trying to give intravenous, intramuscular, and all those things. Are you used to giving subcutaneous injections?
I invite a few responses. How many of you are familiar with using subcutaneous route of administration, and not just for intermittent doses, but also for infusions? If I could have a few responses, that would be great.
Okay. Subcutaneous injection can be comfortably given at the sites mentioned, and there is a page displaying how subcutaneous injection can be given, and the sites on which the subcutaneous injection can be given. You can refer to that. And disinfection, how that can be done, and disposal of waste material. Disinfection, suppose if Ramesh or some other patient has to be cared in the community, usually disinfection is done by 1% bleaching solution, which is prepared by dissolving 30 gram of household bleach in 1 liter of water. 30 gram of household bleach, 1 liter of water, and just keep it for 10-15 minutes, and the supernatant solution you can use. And in home setting, it may be used for 24 hours. But usually in the hospital setting, they used to change it every 8 or 10 hourly. That is what I have understood. Stella, you may correct if I am wrong. And disposal of waste materials also should be done, and the secretions, urine and fecal matter, everything should be put in a closet and flushed off. And self-care, personal protection equipment, safe distancing whenever possible, mask, hand sanitation, everything should be appropriately cared for, and the emotional burden should be addressed. Counseling and regular support by phone calls and WhatsApp chats whenever possible. Regular updating with latest guidelines and protocols, particularly with death and burial or cremation, because Ramesh is going to die at home if he has to be taken home. So what are the recent government guidelines that has to be locally adapted? There is nothing like hard and fast rule. In Kerala itself, the guidelines are changing day by day. So that also should be followed. And local healthcare authorities can help you a lot in this matter. So listening with local healthcare authorities also can do a great help. So palliative care team also has to do this listening. And effective communication is the cornerstone. We face challenges because of it's a very, very distressful situation, high emotional distress, and there are a lot of barriers to communication as well. We have seen the strategies for overcoming it by exploring concerns, active listening, information sharing, acknowledging reactions, and expressing sympathy. And family support is also very important. Complicated grief. So grief can be quite complicated because the patient will be taken from you to COVID treating centers. So the family caregiver may experience grief much before the patient actually dies. So in form of anticipatory grief, they are just cut off from their loved one. So the family caregiver quite frequently they experience anticipatory grief, and there will be quarantine issues. They will be isolated from the society, so they may face stigma. So adequate family support through telephonic, WhatsApp chat, or video calls wherever and whenever possible. And ethics of end of life care. These two photographs, which one do you prefer? In the first photograph, no one is there except a family caregiver. He's just holding the hand. And then the second photograph, you have a very cozy hospital atmosphere with IV fluids flowing, with all monitors and all gadgets, intratracheal tube in situ. You have all the gadgets to help you. Which one do you prefer? Okay. So final hours, if properly managed, family members and caregivers feel confident, and the sense of final gift giving a feel of good death, sense of growth in all the members of caring team. That is what a couple of participants had mentioned in the beginning. So the final gift giving, the memory of the last hours, they will last forever. If it is improperly managed, patient ends up in needless suffering. Family members live with frustration, worry, and guilt, and opportunity for growth is lost for the whole caring team. And both memories will last for the rest of the life for the family caregivers. One on the good side, one on the bad side. And accepting death as it comes, as Tagore and Gail Forman says, it is not, you are not just extinguishing the light, it is just putting out the lamp because dawn has come somewhere. And what I would feel like, what death would be, the nicest, warmest, heaviest, and never-ending nap. If that is the warmest and heaviest nap, okay, it's better to accept it. I am ready for that. The confidence and the readiness with Gail has shown that is that we professionals would feel that. I mean, yes, if that is a good or the warmest nap, we should be able to provide our patients with that sound sleep. So the story doesn't end. Ramesh doesn't leave us. Ramesh has died and his family have expressed their thanks, and he was not alone and did not suffer for long. And they could find an opportunity to speak and see him over the phone, so helpful. So they were so comfortable that they could do whatever possible for their father and the loved one. You are doing a home visit face to face or by telephone to offer support. You find the family particularly distressed as they could not carry out the prayers and the funeral rites because once died, the body has to be buried according to the COVID protocol. So they say our neighbors don't even greet us anymore and we have lost the heart of our family. How will we ever be at peace? Is it a normal reaction?
I would invite the participants to share some of their thoughts or experiences in settings like this, where so many of us are now experiencing death in unfamiliar forms and ways. Have you found any words or ways of soothing the patient's family members' grief or distress at this time? So I guess it's difficult for all of us to respond. We're all searching for the words. Sometimes the silence that I see in the chat box also tells me that all of you are worried and distressed by these things. Time is a great healer. As time passes, everything will be back to normal. Dr. Majachunglu said, now, yes, that is something that can soothe the family.
Yes.
Dr. Kamna says to the family that you did everything what you could do, reassuring the family that they did their best for their loved one. Yes, these are words that will soothe the family. How will we be at peace? Try and be at peace knowing that you did everything that you possibly could to keep him absolutely relieved of suffering.
Yeah, Rajani, it's quite correct. I know, like, these are the expressions of responses following a trauma. You know, they are kind of grief reactions. And the grief reactions can span from physical, emotional, cognitive, social, spiritual, and all domains, making it a total human experience. On the physical setting, the person may feel like, disturbed sleep, low appetite, fatigue. On the emotional domain, they may feel anorexia, aggression, and guilt, or, despair. Cognitive, preoccupation with the loved one, and lack of concentration or attention. And social domain, withdrawal, isolation, uh, you know kind of conflict. Spiritual, loss of connectedness, belief system, or faith, loss of meaning. So what I would like to to understand this is, this is there. Our neighbors don't even greet us anymore, because that could be because of the stigma associated with COVID. But, like, we have lost the heart of our family. How will we ever be at peace? This is a response or reaction to loss. Any reaction to loss, or which is expressed as in a kind of grief reaction, we have to acknowledge that this is normal. Any person who is in your place may experience the same thing. And our immediate premature reactions may not help you. Don't think like that. It is good that he did not suffer, or that kind of, like the philosophizing, our routine way of reassuring the patient may not work. First of all, we have to acknowledge that they are just going through a difficult time, and we have to acknowledge the fact that it is quite normal for them to have this kind of expressions. I am not touching on that stigma part, but as you have explained, time will gradually sit, and you have gone through that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross grief model, DABDA. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. So this may wax and wane and may last for the entire life. It comes and goes, and grief is so unique to one person. And it's normal, and it is so innate and unique for one person. And in some people, it may not cause that much of distress, and in some people, it will cause profound distress so as to affect their functionality and physical performance. In such cases, we need to address their concerns, explore, and if needed, they may have to be referred for a consultation, either to a psychologist or psychiatrist. So bereavement in the pandemic, it is even more complicated. Bereavement is a process or the time during which the grief reactions take place. So it's more complicated due to the changes in the traditional societal mourning process. Everything is taken away, and the funerals, burials, last rites, gatherings, nothing is possible. That is what they could not offer, the last rites. So again, that could complicate the grief reactions and the bereavement process. Okay, so the take-home messages are focusing comfort of the patient, appropriate treatment, stopping futile interventions, effective communication, support of the family during the end-of-life care, end-of-life phase and bereavement phases. So that let us make the last hours comfortable for the patient and memorable for the remaining family members. Thank you for patient listening. These are the additional resources in addition to the regular resource list. And I am so much indebted to my team members from Rajagopal to Smriti. All of them have helped a lot in preparing the slides and the toolkit. And thank you so much. And please fill the feedback form and be ready to address moral distress tomorrow. I think I have overshot the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajri, and thank you, Rajni. This was a really, so much was covered today from the medical aspects, and it was really nice to see such an engaged participation from everybody. I know this is something that has touched all of us in some way or form, and you've handled this entire session so beautifully. Thank you both. And I read so many deeply humane responses in the chat box, which really goes to show that beyond all our medical professional training and everything, what is happening in the world today is really affecting us at a very deep level. So tomorrow's session is on making sense of distress, and it is distress that is affecting not just patients and families, but also healthcare workers. So it is an extremely relevant topic, and please do come for it. Do have a look at the ebook and the webinar before you do. And thank you again very much, everyone, for your sustained participation and interest. And thank you again to the faculty. So see you all tomorrow at 3. Please do sign out with your name, especially if you have a device that is displayed as your name. And also do fill in the feedback form. Thank you all. See you tomorrow.